Fitz. We've had her as a guest before, and I'm glad to see you again. Catherine, can you hear us, see us?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. And we see a nice revolutionary picture in the background.
Actually, that's Gideon from the story of Gideon in the Bible.
Ah, okay.
Painted by a Hungarian who was very revolutionary.
Okay, so that's the okay. Yeah, maybe would you maybe like to introduce yourself to, like, in case people don't know you already, which I guess is only a small fraction, but anyway.
So first of all, let me just say it's always a privilege to be with you. So thank you very much. And I have to do a sneak announcement, which everyone will know next week, but it's not until the beginning of the week that it gets announced. Wolfgang is going to be Hero of the Week on the Solari Report next week, in part for all the things he's done, but finally his new book, False Pandemics, which is available in English. So I just have to plug that. It's terrific. So thank you, Wolfgang.
Thank you. Thank you. Finally in English, very good. Thank you.
Yeah. It's very good. I bought a bunch and I've been spreading them around. So
it has been actualized a little bit. Yes.
Yes. Good. So my name is Catherine Austin Fitz. I'm publisher of the Solari Report, and I also have another company that Solari Investment Screens. And I came from Wall Street in Washington and then got into a big squabble with the Department of Justice in the 90s that made me dig down and learn how the economy really worked. And that's what I've been up to ever since. Our goal at Solari is to help people engineer a for-profit revolution. We're a great believer that what is currently happening with central control is destroying wealth in all its forms, living equity and financial equity. And what we need to do is we need instead to build a civilization that not only builds wealth, but allows control to be dispersed and decentralized. So our interest is in freedom and all the things we need to do to get there. And I think that's what the committee's been discussing since I've known you, is what in the world is going on and how do we engineer things back headed in the direction of freedom. So that's my interests. Anyway, so I'm here today to talk about the Bank of International Settlements. Before I dive in, is there anything you want to say or ask?
No, I think I'm very curious to hear what you will tell us about this, like, creature that's to most people not really well known.
So the Bank of International Settlements, I'm going to do a screen share and bring up my PowerPoint. Let me just get this going. Okay, so the Bank of International Settlements is a bank in Basel, Switzerland, which has as its members 63 of the largest global central banks. So it's not all the central banks, but it's by far and away the predominant ones, G20, et cetera. They have a very good website, so you can learn a tremendous amount about them if you go to the Bank of International Settlements website. They were created at the end of World War II, and the ostensible reason was to handle the reparations from Germany to the Allies. But if you look at the correspondence around them, in fact, the real reason was for many years, the central banks had wanted to create a bank that enjoyed sovereign immunity. In other words, it can operate above the laws of any national government, and it can operate in secrecy. So you're talking about a entity that is above the law, and yet it has the power through its members to create many of the laws, that the rest of us are subject to. And so the title that I gave to these slides is The Use of Sovereign Immunities and Secrecy to Engineer a Global Coup. Now, before I dive in and tell you more about the BIS, I want to use the expression breakaway civilization, because the existence of international institutions with sovereign immunity acting above the law financially and operationally, it's far from just the BIS. The BIS is at the head of a global octopus of institutions which are operating behind sovereign immunity. And so while they don't have to obey the rules, we do. And not only that, they get to create lots of rules for us to obey. And this is one of the fundamental issues that must be addressed if we're going to reverse things and come back to a world of freedom. So one group of people is free to be secret. They are free to print money. So the debt growth model is the secret sauce behind the BIS and the central banks, because they can print money out of thin air and do it in a way that load us down with debt and interest payments. The reality is, there's no reason we need central banks. We are perfectly capable of having currencies and operating economies without central banks. And so one of the issues faced by the central bankers, if they don't move to total control, how are they going to keep control? Because at some point, everybody's going to realize, as the debt continues to explode, oh, you know something? It would be cheaper to operate without you. Now, why are we talking about the BIS, and why is the BIS of interest? There is a push for the creation of a system of digital IDs and central bank digital currencies. And those central bank digital currencies, along with digital IDs, are going to create a system of complete transaction control that will literally be the end of freedom. So if you don't behave, they can literally turn off your money. So I want to show you one video from an IMF panel in 2020. This is October 2020. This is Augustine Carstens, the general manager of the Bank of International Settlements of the BIS. And what he's going to say is that with CBDCs, your deposits are no longer your money, they're their money. They can set the rules, and they can enforce the rules centrally. This is all in 56 seconds. Here we go.
For the use of general use, we tend to establish the equivalence with cash. And there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that. Those two issues are extremely important, and that makes a huge difference with respect to what cash is.
Okay, and then the next slide is another video.
It's possible that even if you have to have CBDC in some form, that you're not destroying the banking system. If you do it the way China is doing it, now you have to remember, China only recently introduced their banking system, and it seems they were not willing to already give it up. They have already CBDC. It's still a pilot project, but it's introduced, among millions of people already. But it was introduced on purpose in such a way that it would not harm the banking system, and therefore is a more truthful sort of update of the old paper money. But of course, it still has the control aspect. So at least it's not killing the banking system. The way they do this is by requiring you to have a bank account in order to get CBDC. So it's not a direct account at the central bank. It's only through your bank that you can get it. You see how simple that is, and of course could be done over here, but they're not discussing it in say the ECB is not discussing it, because you see their agenda is to get rid of banks. But this alternative exists. But then of course the key problem is this control aspect, which at the moment they haven't stepped up in China, but that can be introduced any time, and that of course is a concern. Also, they never talk about the nature of this CBDC. What is it actually going to look like? They never talk about that. Right. But I heard one European central banker tell me what it's going to look like. He saw it. He was invited to one of the old central banks in Europe that are very much promoting this, and they showed him. And he's a top executive director of another central bank in Europe, and there's no reason to believe that he was telling me a story. And he was around this large and would be implanted under your skin. So that is the plan.
Right.
And of course, that has other implications on top of what we've mentioned, on top of the control aspects, because that actually enters your body, maybe violates human dignity, and can be then used for even in terms of functionality beyond the monetary and economic transaction purposes. So highly dangerous and definitely something we have to oppose. And so using cash is one of the things we can do to make sure that the hurdle will be higher for the central planners to introduce the CBDC.
So that is Richard Warner, who is one of the top academic scholars on banking and central banking in the world. And what he's describing is the integration of the financial transaction system controlled centrally with the same systems that do surveillance and entrainment, subliminal programming, and mind control. So you're talking about a full human body system of control that is quite extraordinary, and of course solves the problems that the leadership were dealing with when they canceled slavery. In other words, if you look at the reasons they canceled slavery, this technology solves some of those problems. Okay, so let me jump back. So if you look at where the BIS is headed, it's certainly a very dire place, and we'll get back to that. Let me go back and sort of help you with some of the history. The history of the powers and authorities of the BIS started with the Hague Convention. Again, when they created in 30 and 36, they created a bank to help them ostensibly sort of deal with the reparations coming out of World War I. It was created as a bank with self-perpetuating powers, a self-perpetuating board of directors. It now has 63 central banks and monetary authorities. You can go to their website and it's all fully disclosed. What is of great concern is a network that is now being put in place called the Innovation Hubs, which are hubs around the world designed to help bring in CBDCs in 190 plus countries. Their powers and activities are to hold and transfer gold, to hold, and this is for their members. So for their members, they hold and transfer gold, bank deposits in multiple currencies, securities, data. They promulgate regulatory standards for their members and manage collective investment vehicles as well as services for others, which is not quite clear. But I would note on their balance sheet, they make it clear that they can keep an infinite amount of money in investment pools that are off balance sheet and secret. Now, remember, all of these things can be done for their members in secrecy and immune from the national laws. So you're talking about a money system that can transfer and hold money globally that is both secret and not subject to national laws. So if you look at how this was constructed, it's evolved over many years. Some of them described here. And again, much of this you can find on their website. The date I want to focus you on is 1994, when the New York Fed and the Fed purchased shares. And it was later, a little bit later, that they then closed out all the there used to be private shareholders. When the Fed purchased shares, the Fed had always been active, but felt it was a conflict of interest to own shares. But there was an integration that occurred in 1994. And one of the reasons that's so important is, that was the year, it was fiscal 1997 that vast amounts of money started to disappear from the federal government. So the U.S. federal government since fiscal 1997 is missing 21 trillion, or there's 21 trillion in undocumentable adjustments. And that move started to happen not that long after the New York Fed and Fed bought shares in the BIS. And one of my big questions is, was the majority of that money laundered out through the BIS? Again, the BIS having sovereign immunity and nobody being able to pierce that veil. Remember, the New York Fed is the depository for the U.S. government. So they control and operate the bank accounts. And if there are $21 trillion of undocumented transactions, those transactions were made through the Fed as agent or their member banks. In 1999, a financial stability forum was created that then became a board in 2009 during the financial crisis. And that institution, there are serious questions as to whether they have found a way to extend their sovereign immunities through those institutions, which we'll talk about in just a second. The innovation hubs began in 2019, and these hubs, which are in Switzerland, Hong Kong, Singapore, London, Stockholm, Frankfurt, Paris, Toronto, and then they have a big New York Innovation Center. All of these, from everything we can tell, enjoy sovereign immunity in negotiation with a treaty with a host company, which gives the ability of the BIS and who's ever working on CBDCs with them in that area sovereign immunity, including on the facilities that they have there. If you look at some of the immunities, they can be quite extraordinary. So no one is allowed in the Bank of International Settlements. They have their own, essentially their own police, and the Swiss enforcement folks cannot come in without their permission. They have diplomatic immunity from arrest, imprisonment, seizure. The one thing they're not subject to, they are subject to traffic enforcement. That's the one exception. But this means they can carry documents and data, and digital files and digital assets anywhere in the world behind diplomatic immunity. Nobody can touch them. No taxation, no oversight, no regulation, their freedom from immigration restrictions. They're free to encrypt and exchange encrypted data above sovereign immunity, the freedom from local legal jurisdiction, and on and on and on. And if you look at those powers, particularly to the extent they've been extended through the Financial Stability Board, they are potentially awesome. And when we combine them with the other international organizations who've been created and enjoy sovereign immunity, you are literally looking at, this is the financial train tracks of building a breakaway civilization, which is what has happened. John Titus made a video that I recommend to all of you called All the Plenary's Men about the criminal prosecution of HSB, or the protection of HSBC from criminal prosecution in 2012. And it's this case study that has indicated to us that we believe the BIS has found a way to try and extend sovereign immunity through the systemically important banks, insurers, and payment systems that they run through the Financial Stability Board at the BIS. So the Financial Stability Board has designated systemically important financial institutions, which are mostly banks. You can see them listed over on the right of the slide. They have designated some insurance company as systemically important insurance companies. And then the third group, which is not shown and for which we cannot get any data, is systemically important payment systems, which of course are very critical train tracks within the financial system. And so one of our major questions is, are these banks and insurance companies and payment systems in a position to enjoy some or all sovereign immunities? Increasingly, our guess is yes. Of course, we know the innovation hubs, according to their agreements and treaties with the local country, do appear to enjoy that same immunity. And of course, if it's BIS staff working there, they enjoy that immunity anyway. So as I said, the power of the BIS is not just in its ability to run a global system which can print money and do anything with it behind sovereign immunity and without taxation, and probably, if I'm right, extend it through the systemically important institutions in the FSB. It's that they are the financial train tracks that supplement and complement lots of other institutions that enjoy sovereign immunity, including the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and the IMF. If you look at what has been going on around the world, a lot of what's been happening is debt entrapment, And the IMF and the World Bank, in my opinion, have been critical to entrapping countries in debt, lever them up, and that's all part of the game of getting central control. There is, Corey Lynn has been writing and publishing a series on the extraordinary number of institutions in the Americas and in Latin America created by the United States at the end of World War II that all enjoy sovereign immunity. So the number of institutions that enjoy this sovereign immunity are far greater than what we see on this slide. But there is no doubt, as you are clearly aware, that if you just look at what is being done with the BIS, the United Nations, the Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization, it's extraordinary. Now, the thing I want to underscore is when you give an institution the power to avoid all rules, the power to print money out of thin air, which it can through its members, and the power to enjoy secrecy globally, what you're doing is you're creating a model that is destined by the magic of compound interest to end up owning everything. It's simply a matter of when and how. And so the challenge we're facing here is the model is antithetical to life and antithetical to freedom. And it's certainly antithetical to all the laws, constitutional laws and basic laws of any of the countries that are their members. But what it does is it gives the ability to do what they're doing now, which is basically using their powers to destroy the sovereignty of every nation in the world. Now, if you're the BIS and the bankers, you can do that all with monetary means. You don't need the World Health Organization, but to basically do it in a way that the mob doesn't turn on you and get you with pitchforks. Because if you look at the bankers, they're very few number of people. But if everybody figures out this is the bankers and go after them with pitchforks, they can't do what they're doing. They can't get away with what they're doing because what they're doing is criminal. And that's where the World Health Organization comes in and using pandemics and biowarfare and poisoning to accomplish their tasks. And I believe that if you look at their push through the World Health Organization right now, that's the bridge of control they need to get to the point where they can implement CBDCs. CBDCs and digital IDs are going to be very complicated and difficult to implement. And it's not something that they can do immediately. So the question is, until they get total control through the financial transactions mechanism, how do you build your train tracks of control? And of course, one is controlling the food supply, and another is through the World Health Organization and all the different health bureaucracies like One Health. So if you want more background reading on the BIS, I would recommend a series of different books and articles. I would start with the BIS website and a wonderful book called The Tower of Babel by Adam Labor that was published in 2015. It's got an excellent review of the history and sort of how the bank grew and evolved. I would recommend, again, John Titus's video at his Best Evidence channel, All the Plenaries Men. Patrick Wood has been warning about this for years, and he has an article from 2005 at his website, Technocracy Now, on the BIS, and he focuses very much on the danger of sovereign immunity. I have an article at Solari.com called Does the BIS Owe Us $21 Trillion? And Carolyn Betts wrote an excellent book review of The Tower of Babel if you want to read that and don't have time to read the book. So very good book review and lots of detail about what's in the book. And then I have an article called I Want to Stop CBDCs. What can I do? It's got a copy of the different videos and other very powerful videos that describe the dangers of CBDC quite well. So there's a fair amount of material if you want to get yourself educated. As Corey Lynn at Corey Diggs publishes her articles on the organizations with sovereign immunity, I would also recommend those. As Richard Warner said, it's over on the right. We have every week we publish a cartoon. Right now, if you go to Solera, our newest cartoons are on sex and CBDCs. So we've been on sex for a couple of weeks, but the idea being that people who use cash are much more attractive and fashionable. But here we have a woman checking out at the grocery store, and the cashier says to her, "How would you like to pay, cash or slavery?" Anyway, so on the left is a cartoon we use on Solera. In fact, at the end of March, we just ordered a whole bunch of hats that say "Make Cash Great Again." And we're going to do another series that say cash every day. But the hope is the more people who not only start using cash, but start engaging with their local business people and sort of local merchants about the importance of using cash, the more of the conversation can happen about how we start to build economic resilience at a local level and protect our sovereignty. Because as I said, this is not, we don't, the reason you want to stop international organizations from having sovereign immunity and being above the law, and you want to stop a financial transaction control grid, is that these two things make individual or national sovereignty impossible. And at the end of the day, what this comes down to is, are we going to be sovereign or not? And one of the secret sauces behind the case for our team winning is the financial system is simply a creature of law. It's contract law and financial transaction law that creates financial assets. And we've bubbled the economy with fantastic amounts of financial assets. And if there's not going to be any law and the pirates are above the law, then, all financial liquidity is going to break down, which means that ultimately our team, the freedom team, can create a lot more wealth than the controllers. All they can do is harvest, steal, and control wealth. So at the end of the day, this is really about sovereignty. And I think once you take a serious look at the BIS and the institutions that enjoy sovereign immunity and where they're going, they're creating a world that you and I don't want to live in. So, it's just another picture, and it's another piece in the jigsaw puzzle of how control is engineered. But I think it's an important one, because if you look at the bureaucracies that run the world, the BIS is very much at the top of the bureaucracies that run the world. And if you add the banks and insurance companies that they've designated as systemically important, you've basically put together a combination of the most powerful financial institutions in the world who can print money out of thin air and operate above the law. And that describes a great deal of the train tracks that the corruption has grown on. So with that, let me end this share and turn it over to you for questions.